Welcome everybody. The Ames Free Library is so glad that you're joining us. This masterclass is just one of the many wonderful virtual programs that the staff of the Ames Free Library has brought to you throughout this shutdown. In case you don't know, we are now open for curbside pickup Monday through Saturday. You can take a look at our website for more information about that and other programs. A bit of quick housekeeping. Please keep your mics off at all times. And this program is being recorded for future rebroadcasting. We have a list of questions that were submitted ahead of time for our guest, but if you have a burning question, send it our way in the chat and we'll try to get to it. You can also say who you are and where you are. Give a shout out to David. And before we meet our very special guest, we have a Sizzle Reel video that he shared with us. We're gonna cut to that. Actually, first we're going to show you something else. Not that. How did we get to?
Share the screen.
Sorry about that. This one.
Yep.
David Korins. There it is. All right, here we go. Here's a little background for you. Good ambition. All right, now I'd like to introduce you to our moderators, Nicole DeRosa Canella, a former classmate of David's, and Dory Bryan, the Artistic Director and Director of Education at MMAS, the Mansfield Music and Arts Society, and Black Box Theater. Now it is with great pleasure that I introduce David Korins, one of the most decorated set designers working on Broadway. His sets have been nominated for Tony Awards and won an Emmy, but he says his greatest work so far has been building David Korins Design, which he founded back in 2004. David's credits include everything from Broadway blockbusters such as Hamilton and Beetlejuice to restaurants like Manhattan's Bond 45, the 91st Academy Awards design, concert sets including Bruno Mars, Lady Gaga, and Kanye West, music and arts festivals, and branding for names like Target and Google. But before all that, he was an athlete at Mansfield High School, a member of the choir, concert band, jazz band, and marching band. He starred in the holiday plays and musicals and was president of the MHS class of 1994 due to a successful write-in campaign. He has spoken and shared his gift all over the world, and today he's here with us. Welcome to the Ames Free Library. We're going to show you our Sizzle Reel, And then I'm going to hand it over to your friend and classmate, Nicole. One second.
Dana,
Yeah.
hear me? Some people are complaining that there's no sound. Can the speakers, I've tried to unmute the people who are speaking, so can we check on that before we actually get started?
Yeah.
Okay.
The PowerPoint did not have sound. Is that what they were looking for?
Someone said if the presentation was supposed to have sound, the host needed to share computer sound. So that's something that we should probably check on before we even start.
Is this a PowerPoint or QuickTime?
QuickTime. Let's see, we're about to share a 45-second reel that does have music.
Okay.
Could you hear that?
Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
If they can't hear it, they can't hear it.
All right, Nicole, take it away.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm good. Volume? Yes? All right. Hi, everyone. Hi, Dave.
Hi.
My friend from many moons ago.
Many moons, many moons.
Lots of good ones, though. So what I've done is, since I could obviously just talk to you forever about our past and our history and what shaped us, I decided to ask some of my students, once I told them about our friendship and about Mansfield High School. I have students that I teach theater and auditioning skills to, and they have compiled a list of questions for you as well. So
Okay.
is that okay?
I'll try my best. Yeah. First of all, can I just want to take like 1 second and thank everyone who is spending their afternoon in quarantine, not outside, with us. This is a thrill to me. I told the ladies who arranged this that I had worked my entire career, you know, and had talked to like some really like highfalutin, crazy press people and done a lot of weird things. But by far the thrill of my career was finally getting a call from Dana, Oregon and saying, hey, do you want to do an article in the Mansfield News? I waited my whole life for an interview in the Mansfield News. So I was thrilled. And I'm hoping that this hour and change that we spend together is gonna, you know, unseat that as my high water mark. But I really, really am grateful that everyone took a little bit of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Although weirdly, I'm nervous, more so than I have ever been. I don't know what kind of questions people are going to ask, but let's do it.
All right, so our backstory is, I'm just gonna kind of, first of all, say hi to everybody out there, but I'm just gonna try to catch up with a friend for a second, because it's been a minute, and I just wanted to, as a dad, how are you doing with all this? How are you doing with, how are they doing? Social isolating? How's your wife?
It's a nightmare, and it's fine. I have always tried to see the positive in everything. You know, and I think that sounds like a cliche, but I feel like if you let yourself, you know, read the news and really think about what's going on in the world, you can, you know, choose one of two paths. And I think I kind of vacillate between those two paths, you know, 12 times a day.
Yeah.
You know, my kids just finished school. They're outside. I keep looking that way because they're over there somewhere. we had to, one of them just finished 8th grade and one of them just finished 4th grade. And the whole distance learning thing was a complete unmitigated disaster. We live in New York City. When this thing happened, I was in the middle of putting up a brand new Broadway musical. I was like a little bit of a germaphobe before it was cool to be that. I was standing in the corner, social distancing when everyone was gathered around in production meetings. We were teching Mrs. Doubtfire, a new Broadway musical, which, by the way, when the world comes back up, I highly recommend. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I would go home every night and I was like, this is going to be bad. This is going to be bad. And everyone thought you're crazy. And then of course, New York City became like the epicenter. We live right by Lincoln Center, right in the middle of the whole thing. And walking through Times Square was so devastating. And then to have to, teach online and do all that stuff was incredibly hard, not to mention the fact that my entire business went from, 28 touring productions of Broadway shows and other things all around the world to 0.
Yeah.
Every single day was like a cascade of, hey, by the way, we're going to stop Hamilton in London, Dear Evan Hansen in London, Motown, like everything went away. But the silver lining is I have been cooking and meditating and working out and reading and hanging out with my kids and, spending a lot of time thinking about what the world will look like. I think we all can agree in the best moments, this is like a really welcomed kind of reset. I think, for the world, I think politically, we're seeing a huge amount of unrest, which is needed. From my point of view, things have gotten so far one way. The pendulum has swung so far towards business and me. And the one thing that I think is good about the coronavirus, if there's such a thing, is that it is the great equalizer. It's like we have probably the brightest minds in the world working on a collective solution to what is a complete global disaster. And as someone who lives in New York City, where the bubble was built on top of the bubble, on top of the bubble, on top of the bubble, you can't imagine how expensive and crazy things are there. It's been great to see, real estate and prices and stores and everything just shrink down and close.
Yeah.
And everyone shut up and went home and spent time with their family.
Yeah.
So that's like my last 15 weeks. Now we're I keep looking around at the news and creeping, people creeping out of their houses and trying to do this thing where they don't wear their mask. Wear your mask. It's not over.
Thank
The virus
you.
doesn't care
Thank
how long
you.
you've been stuck. The virus doesn't care how long you've been stuck in your house.
Thank you.
That dog agrees with me also.
Right?
I just feel like let's let the scientists lead, not the politicians. I've been trying to be really productive, and so that's actually how this talk came about. Dana has been fighting the good fight to get me back to Mansfield to do something in person for a long time. And my schedule, as you can imagine, is pretty crazy. And finally, I had done 7 trillion Zoom meetings. And I finally said to my assistant, Dana has been like that squeaky wheel. We should try finally to arrange something for Mansfield. And I think we've all proven with Zoom and all the other technology, we can be anywhere we need to be. And so I actually called her up and said, I think now might be the time. It's not going to be in person, but let's put this together. So it's great to connect to old friends, but it's also great to finally try and give back if there's anything I can possibly do for, my home team.
Yeah. You're saying about your kids being 4th and 8th. So that's what, 14 and 10?
Yeah, almost 15 and almost 11.
Okay, so I have an almost 11 too, and I think she would not mind me saying that her emotions and the mental health, the social and emotional learning has been paramount to anything academic. We constantly are just making sure they're okay.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, my kids were like, we just miss hugs. And, in New York, it's totally different. Well, I'm actually not in New York City right now, full disclosure. I actually, we rented a house outside of the city because, I just tried to put my kids in a place where they didn't have to wear a mask, and gloves, and, shower when they came home every single second. So we actually have a yard. But it's gone from, weird paranoia to worse. And now I think we've kind of equalized. So it's a strange time. I think we should all, I was in New York City with the brownout, the blackout, and a 9/11. So I kind of count myself lucky because we grow through these experiences. You know, and I really do think, I hope that we learn these lessons about preparedness and, you know, global community. We don't just go back to like business as usual afterward. But I know that my family has certainly, you know, when this thing is hopefully in the rearview mirror, we're going to have grown a lot. It's cool.
And that's the thing too. I told my kids is that I don't want this to be something that's in the rearview mirror and we don't take the good stuff from the hindsight. You know, I want to remember not to move at 1,000,000 miles an hour because we were so overscheduled. And that altruism and that idealism that came out of that first few weeks was so heartwarming. And, it, you know, you cited 9/11. That's how I felt after 9/11 for a little while, that there was actually a potential for a little bit of utopia here in the world for a little while. And then after, you know, and then after George Floyd, of course, a much needed unrest unearthed. And I wonder now, as a spiritual person, a faithful person, if there's a reason that we were supposed to be dormant for a while. So all that energy could muster up for positivity. And we wouldn't be able to protest and do things like that if we were all at work. So, you know, trying to teach the kids. I said, you're living through a global pandemic and a national revolution. Go get your journal because this is big and you're going to make history. You know, your grandkids are going to ask you about this. So write it down.
Yeah. And I think also it's a, you know, call to action for everyone to really challenge yourself to be on the right side of history for this kind of a moment. You know, what are you doing? You're right. I mean, I said this before, you know, the Black Lives Matter somehow in the papers have completely erased the global pandemic. I said this before, if you're not going to pick up the paintbrush or pick up the guitar or go work out or whatever now in this moment where you've got 15 weeks stuck in your house, you're probably not going to do it. So I think keeping busy and really prioritizing, you know, getting off the phones and, you know, prioritizing what it is that you want to do. When else in the history of the world, hopefully in our lifetimes, will we ever have get a chance to, you know, plan a production or plan who you want to be with like a year's worth of a runway?
Yeah.
That's like the thing I keep telling all the shows and projects I'm working on. You know, we get a chance to really think about a whole new way to run up to it. And that's actually thrilling to think about. That door's open. My kid's trying to come in from the outside. You know, and so that's actually really, really thrilling. And so and that's another thing that really motivated me to have this conversation, is trying to reach out to members of small communities and students to think about, this is going to be a seismic shift, hopefully, in people's thinkings and their ability to plan who they want to be. And this is the moment where you get a chance to like put that hard work in. So I certainly have been doing it.
And to study, you know, their eyes were watching God, and to revisit some of I unearthed that book from my bookshelf after forever, and showing my kids about Henrietta Lacks and documentaries about who made them and who shaped them in Black culture. And, you know, and I don't know that we would have been able to do that had we had a full plate of soccer and academia and everything else that we normally have going, like I said, at 100 miles an hour. So
Totally.
You know, like I said, I'm a believer, and I think God is definitely in the details in this one. But, and it's funny that I was watching a Jimmy Fallon interview at Lin-Manuel, and he asked him, you know, so are you working on your next big, great project? And he had been maybe a week into COVID. He's like, I'm just trying to learn how to homeschool a toddler. Like, I could have taken this a little bit at a time. Yeah. But we're doing better. We're doing okay. It depends on the day. Over here, you would have been very proud. Mansfield has come a long way. I don't live in Mansfield anymore, but I saw, as what was it, 400 something people gathered in a peaceful protest. And what a sight to see how diverse the town has come and had become, and how positive a change they're making. It's just awesome. And all led by a 17-year-old girl, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but 17-year-old girl, high school senior, who missed out on her senior year, misses out on graduation and prom and whatnot, and instead takes all that energy and creates this massive peaceful protest. 17. Wow. I'd like to know if she's a theater girl. I'll have to try to dig that info up. But I'm glad to know you're well. I'm glad to know the kids are well. Your wife, is she able to travel? And because where's her home?
Well, I don't have a wife anymore. We made 2 children, and then we got a divorce. We still remain very, very close, and we co-parent beautifully. But I have a partner now. And she actually is not here. She had to fly to LA. She's a writer, producer, actress, and she had to fly to LA to care for her family, and will be back in 2 weeks. But actually, that's another amazing silver lining. Talk about the universe putting us all in this amazing place. My kids have, you know, we moved in together. I mean, we're buying an apartment anyway, but we moved in together. It's been like this amazing, you know, interesting stew. And my ex-wife, my kid's mom, we're all in like, we've got a closed circle with her and her boyfriend. It's like it's like sitcom ready.
No, that's the way it should be. I, as one who have a multitude of divorces in my family, it makes sense to nobody else outside the circle but you, and it doesn't need to. You know, and it's
complicated. You know, Marta, my partner, she had to go fly to LA, and she flew with a hazmat mask, a shield, gloves, raincoat. I'm not kidding. There were 6 people on her plane, by the way. So
thank you. No, thank you. And you had said you were germaphobe before this. Was that going back to high school? I don't remember you necessarily being germaphobic.
I wasn't a germaphobic then. I was just like, you know how they have these restaurant ratings, A, B, C, D? I think life's too short for a B. I'm not going anywhere where there's food poisoning involved. And I like to wash my hands. And I was like, you know, I had a couple of bad food poisoning experiences when I moved to New York City. And I was like, when I heard there was a thing that could be passed like that, you know, I started washing I was really good at washing my hands before this all went down.
I gotta ask, you said you were at I think you said it was a Hamilton rehearsal or something, and you said you had an idea that this is gonna be bad. So was there rumblings?
Well, I mean, I think that, like, you know, one of the things about America in general is we have so much hubris. And like, even though our education system is something like 15th in the world in math and, you know, 11th in the world in verbal, we think we're number one in everything. And so I'm watching the news, and I'm like a science geek, and I'm like a stats guy, even though of course I make emotional things. And I was like watching, and there was a hotspot in Seattle, and there was a hotspot in New Rochelle, New York, which is like, you know, 10 miles away from where I live. And I watched every day, and, you know, CNN and other news outlets were kind of running like, what is this, you know, coronavirus thing? And I thought, there's no possible way. I've seen what happened in China. I'm actually in the middle of working on a project that the writer director he is a Chinese guy. And I had a FaceTime with him because he was of course in China a couple weeks earlier, and they were already quarantined, and it hadn't yet gotten to America, or maybe there's the first case in Seattle. And I thought, China is a massive, massive country, landmass wise. And he was quarantined, and he showed me out his window, and there wasn't a person on the street. And I thought, this is not going to go well. And, you know, I remember the producer of our show saying, the only virus is fear. The only virus is fear. And I thought, no, there's actually a virus.
What does that mean?
Well, he was, you know, listen, he's the producer of like a $30 million Broadway show. He did not want to see the show get shut down. And I think that everyone just assumed, well, it's not going to happen to me. I lost my uncle to COVID-19 because he was one of those people who, you know, lived in Yonkers, New York, and he couldn't get a bed, and he was, you know, in one of those horrible cases where he was at risk, and he got the virus and couldn't get a bed and couldn't get a room and couldn't get treatment, and he passed away. And so it's, you know, I think one of those things that when you look at those numbers, we're so used to through video games and, you know, movies and Hollywood sensationalizing all this stuff. We're so used to human death on a scale. You know, we were talking about 9/11, that killed, you know, 2,000 people. This has killed, you know, 120,000 people in this country alone. And what you don't realize is the exponential, you know, magnitude of every one of those people as a whole family, a community, and everything else. This is like on the, you know, not to say that 9/11 wasn't a horrible thing, because it was, but this dwarfs it on such a staggering scale that it's almost impossible to quantify. Right. So, you know, the only virus is fear is like an insanely stupid thing to say, you know, when you think about that.
No,
Boy, this is getting dark and weird, isn't it?
I know. We'll lighten it up. But I first of all, I'm sorry about the loss of your uncle, and it hit home for us big time too. And we'd be remiss if we didn't bring it up. I mean, we're facing it. This is our life right now. So obviously we have to go there. But like I said, I think it's going to bring out some light. We're just going to have to take some time to see it in a bigger picture. And Americans can be so myopic. Everybody's so, closed in. And I think once we see this on a bigger meta scale, we'll hopefully see that each one of those lives had a ripple effect and it wasn't just a number.
I think the saddest thing is going to be when all the dogs that have been adopted and that are getting trained at home, and then like when their families go back to work and school, the dogs are going to like need serious medication. Think about it. It's going to be like, right. I mean, any new dog is totally screwed for the rest of their life. They're going to have like the most separation anxiety.
My vet
that's what I keep thinking about.
Oh, my vet calls it the COVID puppies, COVID puppy syndrome, and I've got one. We got a puppy in January, right before this all hit.
It's not going to be good, guys.
I know my time's going to fly with you, so I'm going to have to make do for this little time, and then we'll connect afterward. So I definitely want to keep talking, but I want to ask you and tell you a couple of things. First of all, Lisa Orchard Nielsen, I don't know if that name rings a bell, but you went to high school together, and she said this. She said, "Dear David, when you were a senior in high school and I was a tiny little freshman, you completely built up my confidence during band and choir. You were never afraid to give thoughtful and kind words of praise and cheered me along. I want you to know that these moments stuck with me throughout the years while I became a performer and a teacher. Do you have any words for our students that are coming up in the theater and music world to cheer them along? I would love nothing more than to pass them along to my drama club from an old friend. Best, Lisa Orchard Nielsen."
Oh, first of all, thank you. I see you on my screen, which is exciting. I'm on an iPad. You're in like the Jan Brady spot or someone. I don't know where you are. But anyway, hello, good to see you. My advice is similar because I feel like it works. And that's why things like this are a little bit weird. I know people are kind of interested in the path that I took. The path that I took is not a path that can be recreated because, I lived it, and so it's not for others. But to me, what has worked is, the more you can read, the more you can see, television shows, movies, and the more you can travel. I always talk about imagination like it is a fountain. And when you travel, you fill up that fountain. You fill it up with water, and the bursts can be bigger and more interesting. And then you use it up. I feel like my work looks varied and interesting, but the truth is there's about 6 ideas in there. They're just repurposed and kind of there are different veneers over it. And so I always feel like, and of course it's hard to travel right now, but traveling, meeting people. When I moved to New York, the technical director at my college said to me, I have 2 pieces of advice. He had worked in New York for 25 years before he became a professor. And he said, on every street corner, walk with your head up, not down. So many people kind of do this as they walk down the street corner. On every street corner, there is someone more and less fortunate than you. There is, some amazing like 3-part rock opera going on every single street corner. Learn from the people around you. It's the most amazing, incredible place. And the other piece of advice he said is never eat, no matter how hungry you are, never eat a knish from a street vendor, which I thought was like the weirdest thing, but clearly he had a bad time. That's where I got the food poisoning thing.
I've done it.
Really.
I've done it with mustard.
So he's like, just no matter how hungry you are. But the truth is, I think like when we as creatives, in the theater or in anywhere in entertainment, it's all about storytelling. My way in has been through physical space, but an actor has to learn how to, embody a certain character. Writers write what they know. Directors have to learn how to like work through time and space and character development and plot. And we all are telling a story through, certain guardrails. And so I feel like the more you become adept at communicating and the more you become a student of life, I consider myself a storyteller, but I really think I'm a behavioral scientist. I'm a behavioral psychologist. I think about how people move through space and what would make things easy for them to interact with and what would make things difficult for them to interact with and what's interesting about that. And I think making sure that your students like open their eyes and open their hearts and open up their spirits to new and interesting experiences. I mean, you wrote me that beautiful letter, and like the truth is you remembered something that happened 30 years ago. That's an important, you know, touchstone moment. And so I think being open to those things, you know, I think there's a famous quote, which I'm sure I will butcher, about traveling. And if you only, every place that you go is like, if life is a book, every place you go is another page, right? And so if you never go anywhere, you've only read one page. And I think anyone that has ever traveled to anywhere different from where you grew up, you can see that all the pages are so different and beautiful and interesting. And so I think just mine that material for new stuff. That's the biggest thing. The rest of it is like technical, and there are ways to cover those weaknesses, but opening up your mind as a creative storyteller is the thing.
Okay. And let me see. Gosh, was that a half an hour? Did a half an hour go by so fast?
Yeah, well, who cares about quarantine, Nicole? Jeez, enough already.
That was too fast, my friend. All right, so I'm gonna hand it to you.
You got my number.
Yes, I will. We'll talk more. You know, I love you. I have amazing memories, of our MHS years that shaped me, and I love every single bit of the history that we made together. And I'm gonna hand this down to Dory. Is she Marcia or Jan now? I don't know. I can't see.
Hi, David.
Hi.
I am so excited to ask you these questions that I put together. And I just wanted to thank you for your time. Thank you very much. So my first question for you, early in my career, I reconciled the theater as a suitable church for me, more so than the church of my upbringing. And it was a place where I felt at home, I felt useful, and I felt whole, connected to something bigger than myself. And I'm curious as to how you experience the creative process.
Well, I, relate to that. I grew up as like one of 3 Jews in Mansfield, the other 2 being my sisters. So I was like, what is this place? And, how do I fit in? I do think there's a thing, Barbara Trombley, who was our theater teacher and choir director, she always would talk about this feeling that you would get when you were performing, that I think was very impactful. I was a big athlete growing up, and I think that there's a similar feeling for an athlete, kind of this improvisation. You might have a play that you're thinking about, but trying to execute, but there's an improv that happens in real-time experiences, and that's what live events give you as well. That is a spiritual kind of connectivity. Mm-hmm. There is a thing that happens on a live event that, even if you say the words exactly the same way and you execute the scene changes the same way, and it's a different audience, it's a different chemical makeup, and it is a kind of spiritual connectivity. Mm-hmm. So, I obviously see the resemblance. I felt the resemblance, and I, make my living, tweaking that resemblance to kind of get what I want. Mm-hmm. That's what we do as performers. We kind of like take all of the things, all of the tools that we have, and we, like mad scientists, sprinkle in a little more of this or a little more of that to make our audiences feel a certain way. Mm-hmm. There are no, what I've learned over the years is audiences together and collectively are smarter than one single individual. You can mm-hmm. tell that when someone, like one person laughs at a joke in the theater and then like the rest of everyone laughs, it's not because they're sheep following, the leader. It's because you see in that response, oh yeah, right, I thought that was funny too. There's a permission. That's the same thing in church or temple or synagogue or mosque or anything else. There mm-hmm. is a spirituality to that. And it's like something gets transpired between the performers and the audience that can never be recaptured. Mm-hmm. And it's like the closest thing to spirituality I've ever found.
Sure, thank you.
Sure.
My next question is stage director Ariana Mujkin. I'm probably saying her name wrong, but she has a famous quote, "People should leave the theater more human than when they came in." I want to know how that quote hits you, and what has been a memorable or rewarding audience reaction to your work, and what experiences do you work to provide your audience? And I would just like to say that I wrote this question before I watched one of your TED Talks, which really clarified the answer, but I still want to ask it because I think it's really interesting.
Well, I mean, that question that's a doozy. There's like 4 parts to it.
So I know, I snuck it in.
So, I mean, I would say, listen, I think, the theater changing you is the truth. When you're writing a story or you're telling a story, the protagonist has to change, right? No one going through a story can stay the same at the end, or else it's not an interesting story, right? So I think the audience is the same way. You come in one way and you need to witness the protagonist go through change, and then you will feel change yourself. So that's sort of an obvious piece to the puzzle. With regard to what it is that, like an amazing audience response that I've seen, I've been doing this for, 25 years.
Wow.
I have witnessed some really emotionally impactful moments. I can tell you, I was in tech rehearsal for D. Irvin Hansen the night of the election in 2016, Trump versus Clinton, and everyone left thinking we're going to have a female president. And then the next day, we didn't have a female president. And what that audience relationship was unbelievable. I can tell you that I've had experiences. Hamilton, which is a show that I worked on, became, we all thought that Hamilton was a show about America then, performed by what America looks like now. And after the 2016 election, the day after the election, that show became, in a way, a period piece, because we really had like a gut check moment of maybe this isn't what America looks like now. Certainly the voices that rang true on election night in 2016 were not the voices that we saw on stage. I was also there when Mike Pence was in the audience and the performers of Hamilton decided to have a open and candid conversation with him, and then watched all that ensue. I was also in the audience when Barack Obama, I was 2 rows away from him when he watched Hamilton, and I witnessed the first and only African-American president watch an African-American man portray George Washington stepping down, teaching the country how to lead. And I remember, watching him watch that number, and it was like, and everyone in the room was like, oh my God, Barack Obama is watching Chris Jackson sing like One Last Time, and this thing about someone stepping down so that the rest of the country and the rest of history could step in line and learn how to govern ourselves. And it was like staggering, I've also been in audiences where like stuff gets really messed up. Actors drop lines, scenery breaks, horrible things happen. I did a show where Patti LuPone, of all people, she was riding out on a piece of scenery. It tracked off stage. Something backstage didn't move properly, and she almost got killed from a thing that I designed. And, screams and yells, and it was okay. But like, imagine, for like 38 seconds, I thought I killed Patti LuPone. It wasn't a highlight of my career. So, I've seen a lot of different things, but I think that like, sometimes the most interesting things that happen are the ones that you're not even aware that they're happening. Speaking to the TED Talk, a lot of what I try and do is, I talk a lot about implicit bias and color theory and line and perspective, and taking all the things that I know work on people and tweaking them to get what I want. Basically, every single design is like a way to Jedi mind trick you into like thinking a certain kind of way. So with regard to that, I think that like, that's the kind of mad scientist part of our jobs. When when you watch Hamilton, we want you to think it's an important story. We want you to feel more American and smarter, and that this is an important, substantial work of art. And we've obviously succeeded in that, because there are 2 things that that the general public feels about that show. Number 1, it's hard to get a ticket and it's expensive. But number 2, that if you don't like it, there's something wrong with you, right? You're like, well, I didn't like it, but I know that I'm wrong. That's like, there's a lot of different levers that we're pulling to make the thing feel important with a capital I. So that's the kind of mad scientist part. That's the thing that's like most fun for me, really.
Thank you. My next question is, there is a funny story about stage director Anne Bogart, who says that when she's sitting in the theater watching a rehearsal and things are not going well, she stands up and says, I have an idea. she has absolutely no idea, but she thinks that by the time she gets to the foot of the stage, an idea will come, and it always does. And I just wanted to ask you about that story. What do you do for creative inspiration?
You know, I'm looking around for a piece of wood to knock on. I have a lot of friends who are writers. They oftentimes go through writer's block. I have so far, I have kind of a boundless imagination. I'm not saying all my ideas are winners. I have plenty of terrible ideas, but what I normally do is give myself a minute. You know, it's really hard to schedule a time to be creative. I run an office. We have a lot of people working there. It's a deadline-based industry. You know, for me, I used to go running, you know, to try and get a little oxygen. Lots of great ideas come in the shower, but the truth is my fountain of ideas has not run dry. And I trust my mind that I'm going to be able to like spit out some good ideas. And that really and truly, that's not the case, you know, for everyone, but for me, it's more about the process of kind of curating the ideas that pop up and thinking, well, I've heard that. That's a terrible one. I see that. That's never going to work. It's not feasible. This one, there might be a germ of something interesting. But I think the best ideas are the worst ideas, right? I mean, think about it. You know, if someone said to you, like, let's go put a man on the moon, you know, that would have seemed like a really dumb idea, except it wasn't in the rearview mirror. I saw that with Hamilton. You know, no one would have greenlit that if that was a movie pitch. You know, a bunch of people who are minorities dressed up like, you know, the founding fathers of our country, told with hip hop music, right? And now it's made more money than like any Broadway show has tracked, you know, in the history of the planet. Now, you know, so it's like, what that sounds like it might sound like a bad idea, but what about it is a good idea? And so I start to just spit things out in the spirit of no bad ideas.
Yeah. William Ball talks about that. He says, when people give me their ideas, I always listen.
Of course.
Go, because eventually they'll download the gold. The gold. So as a designer, what is the most useful information a director can provide you, and what is unhelpful?
Oh, that's interesting. You know, before I read anything, a script or, you know, a screenplay or anything like that, I always ask the director for like a couple sentences. They don't need to give me like a big long missive or, you know, anything about like, here's what I think it's going to be, but just a couple sentences to frame it for me. You know, the director is inevitably the arbiter of taste and the kind of like going to be like due north of what direction we're going to go. If you're doing Romeo and Juliet and they say, I want to set this in, you know, 1920s, then like that's where you're headed. I like to hear that, but then I like to kind of read the script and let it wash over me a couple times, just like a meditation, and just like understand for myself what I think it is. I had to make a decision a long time ago to either be a yes person or a me person. And what I mean by that is a lot of people, I think, govern their lives with fear. And you know, I've read somewhere, you know, there's really, in the end, only two motivations and two emotions, and they are love and fear. And you do things, everything drills down to that. When I'm a collaborator on a project, I have to choose love, meaning I have to embrace the fact that someone has hired me and not the other person. And so as opposed to saying, yes, Kanye West, I think that's an amazing idea.
Right.
I could say, I actually think that, like, tell me more about what you're getting at. What is it that you want people to feel? Let me understand what the thing is that you're trying to accomplish. And just trust the fact that, like, he hired me to be in the room because he respected me and my opinion and all that I am. And not just say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Because what you have to realize is these people are not your friends. They are going to ask you to do, you know, the impossible for the ungrateful. You know, that's just the deal. And I think you have to learn how to like trust your instinct and be kind of director proof. You have to like say, tell me the direction we're going in, and then like let me trust the fact that you want to hear from me.
Right. I read somewhere Americans are addicted to agreement. And the problem with that is that if we don't have that kind of creative tension, because that's where the good stuff can really come from, is that disagreement and that tension, right? So thank you.
Totally. Sure.
Are there, I'm sure there are, but are there personal sacrifices that you have made to sustain a New York career?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I get asked a version of that question, seen through the eyes of the person asking frequently, young designers, young creatives asking me, should I move to New York? What do I do? And my feeling is, if you don't have to live in New York, meaning if you don't have like the ego that tells you, I need to work on the original production of this thing, or the first ever version of this, or the world premiere of that, you can make a living in the arts anywhere. There's obviously a higher volume of projects happening here or there than anywhere else and all of that. But I originally moved to New York because I didn't know where else I could go, and all of the connections that I was making at Williamstown Theater Festival and in the training programs that I went to after high school and college and beyond were all connections to New York. And then the woman that I met and married, was from New York. So we, we're going to build a life in New York. But the design challenges for a play or a musical or whatever are the exact same whether you live in Milwaukee or Kansas or LA or London or anywhere else. It's just that the world premiere work happens in New York. And so for me, I got into that system. It's incredibly challenging living in New York. But I remember when my oldest daughter was about 4 or 5 years old, she was studying Jackson Pollock in preschool. And I said, let's get into a taxi. We went to a taxi. We drove to MoMA, into the room where there were 4 big Jackson Pollock paintings. And there were these 3 Japanese women who were crying in the room. And my daughter was like nervous and scared and like, what's wrong with them? And I approached and I said, are you okay? And they said in perfect English, we waited our entire lives to get into this room. And I thought, we zipped down in a taxi and were there in 9 minutes and got to MoMA. And so there are these things that happen in New York City. It's one of the things that's most challenging in the coronavirus is you ask yourself, if you don't have culture and experience and restaurants and the people, what do you have? You just got like big bills. But as far as a career in the arts, if you don't have to be in the epicenter, you could be anywhere.
Yep. Yep. So as an artist, what do you view as most important, or perhaps a leading quality? Imagination, curiosity, research, observation, collaboration.
Well, if you're talking about theater, film, or not what I would call not a fine art. A fine art is what I would call sculpting, painting, dance, something that you could do on your own.
Yes, your work, David, a designer. You're a designer.
I think we are collaborative artists. So if you can't collaborate, you're in deep trouble.
Yeah.
I think all of the things that you mentioned, creativity, collaboration, observation, they're important. To me, the number one skill is communication. And what I mean by that is kind of like omnidirectional, multifaceted. You have to hear what the director is saying, or the writer or the composer is saying. And not everyone is like, silver-tongued, completely articulate. Some people don't articulate themselves well verbally. You have to be able to hear it and synthesize the information you're hearing. And then something that's trapped in your head that you can't put down on paper is also not useful. I started out my career, I could not draw. I can barely draw still. But I had to learn how to take what was in here and put it onto a piece of paper. And so research became important, other ways to communicate. That's why I developed a sense of verbal skill, because I was able to say, this is what I really mean. This horrible doodle is meant to say, it's an 8-foot tall doorway. And being then, once you've kind of got community buy-in on what the project that you're designing wants to look like, then there's this whole other level, which is probably the most tricky, is how to get the hundreds of craftspeople, artisans, builders, painters, welders, technicians who are building the thing and willing it into existence to actually understand what this little doodle or this set of drafting was supposed to look like. Mm-hmm. And that communication is huge. and that's why when you go to the theater, you see a movie, you think it doesn't look that good. It's not because it didn't look good in the designer's head. It's because they couldn't get the people working on it to like get it and to like take what was up here and make it, supersized.
So how did you do that with Hamilton?
I think that listen, the set design for Hamilton is not a real place.
Right.
I attack every project as though the design is going to be a real place. So I think Hamilton spans over 30 years. There's 51 songs. There's 26,000 words. There's probably 100 locations in the play. I researched every one of those rooms and every one of those locations as if we were going to make the feature film hyper-realistic version. But then I broke down the script and thought, what's the bare minimum we need? We're not going to go to the Schuyler Mansion in the show. We're going to show like a bench and nothing else. But the metaphor, like in theater, we work in metaphor frequently. The metaphor for the design of Hamilton is we are telling the story not of the people who built the country or built the foundation of the country, but we are telling the story of the people who created the framework from which the people who are the Americans. And so what I wanted to do was create something that felt foundational and permanent and like forever, like the substance of the country. And then we put this kind of wooden scaffolding, around it as if to say, work is being done here. This is an aspirational space. This is a space that is being built up. And I took it was sort of a tapestry of early American architecture. So I researched the way that wood went together, the types of carpenters of the time were all people who built ships. So all of the joints in the wood are all shipbuilding methodology. All of the ropes and all of that stuff are the actual ways in which things were built there. And then, I showed exhaustive amounts of research. And I basically stood over the shoulder of the artisans and the painters and the craftspeople and helped, make sure that the thing looked in real life what I had imagined it would mind. I mean, we made renderings and drafting, we took pictures, we painted, paint elevations to guide people. But in the end, it was a whole lot of, especially the off-Broadway production, myself and my associate built a lot of it. We stood there and coiled that rope and we painted those boards and we carved that brick and we put that thing together.
Wow, thank you.
Sure.
If you were going to write a book, what would the focus be?
I actually have been approached to write a book, and cover your ears. The book is going to be called Mindfuck: How to Design the World to Get What You Want.
Oh, I like it. Very cool.
Sorry for the swear, guys. But the idea is, I was sort of talking about it a little bit earlier. I studied for years implicit bias, and implicit bias is you probably heard on the news. It's one of those things like think on your inside your mind, but you're not aware that you're thinking it. It's the thing that makes police officers often shoot African-American people and not white people, right? There's an implicit bias. But there are many implicit biases, not just race. There are implicit biases about men and women, sexual orientation, things that are tall, things that are short, things that are overweight, things that are old. And so I've studied this deeply. I found that there's something called the IAT test. It's an implicit bias test. You can actually scientifically prove your biases. And I thought that was so fascinating. So between studying that and Feng Shui and color theory and other kind of design ideas, I have spent a career over 2 decades using those implicit biases to make people feel what we want them to feel. And I can give you some examples of that. People, I know this sounds horrible, people respect tall people more than short people, fit people more than not fit people, men more than women, right? All these horrible things that you wouldn't want to be true, but they are true. But when you're a designer, you're a creative, you get to use those biases to elicit certain responses. Here's a version. Why does Darth Vader wear black and carry a red lightsaber? Because black is the color of evil. Why is that the case, right? Well, we're mammals, we're not nocturnal, we respond to the day in a different way than we respond to night. We're scared of the dark. You know, that's why the evil character wears that color. Dorothy wears like a gingham blue dress. We're attracted to the sky blue, right? There are these obvious things that are implicit biases that people are not aware of. So the book would be how to design the world to get what you want, right? If you want to control the boardroom and you want to see and you want to feel empowered, you should put your chair a couple of inches higher than the people in the boardroom, and you will feel in control. And they will subconsciously go, why do I always look up to Michael Horrigan? Well, because he's like so tall up in his screen.
Thank you. Very interesting. I have one more question and we have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
How do you balance honoring the creative process with the demands of getting your job done? And how in New York theater is the balance between art and business maintained?
Well, listen, I think that there is a perception in the world that somehow reviews, you know, drive business. It's not true. Wicked is one of the biggest box office, you know, successes in the history of theater. It got B- at best reviews. I think if you are driven by commercial success, you're in deep trouble. You know, see the aforementioned thing of like, no one thought that the idea of Hamilton on the page would be a good idea. No one would think that Dear Evan Hansen would be a good idea. I mean, a story about like a kid that like committed suicide and like, you know, like a troubled kid who tells a lie. Like it's not, you know, on its face, a great commercial endeavor. I learned early on, if I like it and the people that hired me like it, good enough. There's always going to be 12 people in the audience that think your work is terrible. There's always going to be 12 people in the audience who think everything you do is like vanilla ice cream. It's like, you know, who cares? You don't need reviews. What you need is a word of mouth. I mean, another show that I did is Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice got bad reviews in Washington, D.C. Like objectively bad reviews. Like, please don't come to New York City. You're dead on arrival. We came to New York City. We made a lot of changes. And, you know, between TikTok and Instagram and a young audience, it got massive traction. And the thing is, there's only one review that matters, which is, would you recommend it? Would you recommend it? Because your word is what you've got. And, you know, the theater industry and entertainment industry has no shortage of, you know, options to see, but would you recommend it? And Beetlejuice is unlike any other show on Broadway, truly, and it's fun, and it's hard to not recommend it. It's funny, it's touching, it's big, it's lavish, and so in my mind, it's like, if I could recommend it to someone, that's what drives me. It's not about commercial success.
Cool. I think, Dana, are we ready to take some questions from the crowd? Okay, awesome. So I'm seeing a question here from Olivia Pierce, and she writes, what is a show you've always wanted to design the set for? And she's referring to a Broadway revival. Is there a Broadway revival you would like to design?
Oh, wow. I mean, I grew up listening to like all the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows. You know, Fiddler on the Roof also comes to mind. Not necessarily because of these design challenges, but because I just remember like mowing my lawn, you know, being like that geeky theater kid, like listening to like show tunes. I always wanted to design Carousel, but there have been a couple of really amazing revivals of that. So that's probably not coming around anytime soon. I'm not going to tell you which one, but I actually have just been offered the job to design a pretty major revival of a show. And it had never been on my radar. And in fact, it was a show that I didn't really know. But when it came to me, I thought, oh my God, I've never designed a musical revival ever. So I suppose my short answer is any, but now I got one. So look for it in 2022.
Cool,
Nice.
thank you. We have a question from Michael McCucci from Walnut Hill. And he asks, how do you approach a script with many locations that don't seem to have a natural flow?
Well, that gets back to that Hamilton problem. You know, I think what I do this thing called a scene breakdown, and it's not original to me. Almost every designer does it. If you figure out the least amount that you need to put into each scene, for instance, this scene right now is me talking to my iPad, sitting at a table with a chair. There's a screen door there. There's a chandelier over my head. All I need to do this scene is me and this iPad. Yes, I could have the table and the chair, but I don't need it, right? And so I kind of make a laundry list in order of what the least amount that I need. And then if you do that and you kind of distill and crystallize every single detail of the scene. Now, if I picked up my iPad and threw it through the window and smashed my iPad, I would need the window, right? The window becomes part of the story. But if the window is just there and I'm looking out it and I never refer to it and I never touch it, I might not need it. And so I do this scene breakdown to figure out the least amount needed. And then I kind of like jigsaw puzzle it. Well, I know I need a window 3 times. Okay, it seems like the window is going to be in there. I know I might want a window, but I don't necessarily need that. And that's the kind of thinking that I do in every project. And so you create like a little tiny list of things you must have, and you have to think about like needs versus wants.
Awesome, thank you. And the other question that he had is, how did you figure out the process in Beetlejuice, changing the house multiple times? There's a lot to change each time. It must be choreographed with every detail.
I wish I could just tell you it's theater magic and we wave our wands. It's not the case. I didn't really figure it out. I knew what I needed, and I work with this genius associate. His name is Rod Lemon. He and I have worked together for 20 years, but also the scene shop that built it is, you know, incredibly adept. Basically, we figured out a system that the only thing that didn't change is the floor and the ceiling and the one surface of the walls. And then we basically made these amazingly well executed, magnetized pieces that, you know, we snap in behind, we drop down a curtain, we keep playing the scene, and we bring in all these big, huge pieces and we put them against the wall. We get rid of all the furniture, the doors, the window treatments, and the chandeliers. And so it looks like a complete change. But if you look closely at the design, the ceiling and the floor and the back section of the walls remain. So the physical piece maintains its integrity. And then it's just about like, essentially like fancy toppings on the cupcake.
Thank you. This question is from Amit Mir. Speaking of Beetlejuice with the tour coming, is there a difference between designing for a touring production and a sitting production? Also, what thoughts come to mind as possible issues to tackle when taking a show on the road?
So truck space, truck space, truck space. When you tour something, my goal and the goal of everyone that sends out a tour is to try and make the ending visual result be the thing that you see on Broadway. That's the goal. It doesn't always seem like that, but what you have to do is touring shows move in on a Sunday and they open to an audience on a Tuesday. So you have about 10 hours to load in the set, take it off the trucks, stand it up. And so there's a lot of different engineering that happens, and there's obviously a lot of different methodologies with regard to building. You know, the Hamilton set on stage at the Richard Rodgers on Broadway is like, you know, big, heavy, crazy, you know, permanent stuff. The floor that we take on the tour is re-engineered. It basically rolls off and goes together in a matter of like 6 hours. And then a lot of the stuff is soft, it rolls up, it gets Velcroed onto frames that fly out. A lot of the different methodologies are different, but in the end, talk about Jedi mind tricking. We Jedi mind trick people into thinking it's the same thing because our goal is to deliver the same look, but the way it feels to the actor might be very different.
Thank you. Let me see. Molly McDonald asked, what is the most unique part of the Mrs. Doubtfire set? Is there any piece of the design the audience should be most excited for to find?
I mean, I sprinkle every design I do with a bunch of like Easter eggs, like little things that if you know the show or know the movie or, you know me, I try and have like a subconscious dialogue with the audience all the time. But you know, the bigger thing for Mrs. Doubtfire, at least, is I like the color story that we tell between the Hillard house, which is like mom's house, and dad's house. It's interesting to like think about, you know, what colors represent warmth and family. And, you know, I think Mrs. Doubtfire is a story about a divorced dad doing whatever he can to like be with his kids, right? That's the story. To me, the thing that you should keep your eyes on is the like absolutely unreal performance that Rob McClure makes as Mrs. Doubtfire. His performance makes you forget about Robin Williams. And what's so amazing and incredible about it is, as opposed to the movie, you watch him as a human suffer to put that stuff on and take it off and do all this stuff. And it's like the human pyrotechnics of just getting in and out of that costume and doing that before your eyes is like extraordinary.
Owen Parker asks, can you tell us a little bit about the pool that was cut from Hamilton?
Totally. Research, you know, Hamilton was one of the only founding fathers that didn't get a memorial. You know, there's obviously the Washington Monument, there's the Lincoln, the Jefferson Memorial. There's all these memorials all over. And I took a trip to DC, but I also, you know, through a ton of research, it's interesting that Hamilton didn't get a memorial. The idea came from, at the end of the show, it would be interesting. If you go to DC, you see a trillion reflecting pools everywhere, all over the city. We thought it'd be interesting to make a version of a reflecting pool. So in the end of the show, when they're asking the big question of who lives, who dies, who tells your story, Alexandra and Eliza somehow reunite in this magical place, like of heaven or the other world or whatever. You know, she living for another 50 years and he kind of like a specter of who he used to be. And there was this pool with this inky black water that was beautiful. And we played for 3 performances. At the end of the show, the founding fathers would pull up this thing and move it. And it was like this amazing moment. And the light would reflect off the water and hit them. And it was all very beautiful. But inevitably what happened was the question that you want to be thinking at the end of the show is who lives, who dies, who tells your story? You know, have I done enough for my legacy and all that? And in the end, you were saying, is that real water? Are those things heavy? David Korins put a pool on stage. You were asking all the wrong questions, like, you know, and we were just like, we were putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong moment. And so the director looked at me and said, we're cutting it. We're draining the pool. And we played for another, you know, 5 months with a drained pool at center stage that no one ever knew about.
Wow.
Thank you. Wow.
Can't hit the bullseye every time, kids. You know what I'm saying?
I have a question from my daughter, actually. Olivia, age 13, almost 13. She wants to pursue a career in singing. She's quite good, I will say, as a mom. But she asked me, when you're designing for a performance artist, do you kind of work around their set list or do you work around their personality? And second, sometimes people don't say no to said celebrities. So in your job, you had mentioned earlier that, you know, you have to sort of say no, that something can't work sometimes with them. How does that work? She wants to know.
Yeah, I have no problem saying no. I just think like we forget how much pressure, you know, a Bruno Mars or a Lady Gaga or a Kanye West has on them. You know, Bruno Mars is 30 years old. You know, he's arguably the most talented and popular songwriter that we have in America of pop music. And every tour he goes out on is like, you know, 100 million people will see it. So they're all over the place. They're busy making music. And again, like what is your lane? You have to be able to say no, because you have to be able to help this person achieve what their goal is. And ultimately what their goal is that they're going to be able to like show this thing consistently to an audience properly. I don't work around the set list because the set list changes all the time. There isn't a person who shows up, unless they're lip syncing, that just does the same show every night. You know, and especially someone like Bruno or Gaga, they're all over the place. You know, they might say, I'm throwing out all the new material I'm doing, you know, the top third is going to be new stuff and the rest is going to be greatest. It's all over the map. So you don't work around that. But what I find the most interesting about working with artists like that is having the conversations about like, what was the inspiration behind the album? You know, every album's kind of like a story, and we don't listen to music now the way we used to. We used to buy an album and listen to it top to tail. Now we do it, you know, a song gets released. If that song is popular, they release the next one, et cetera, et cetera. No one listens to the thing as like a story, but the writers, the musicians write it as a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, the most interesting thing is having conversations about why they wrote this, why this album sounds differently, what it was they were going for. You know, I think back to Gaga's album, Joanne, which I worked with her on. She had she named it after her aunt that she never met, that died of a disease before she was born. There was a picture of her up in her kitchen that she looked at for her whole life. It was her dad's sister. You know, she always had this picture of who Joanne was. You know, Joanne meant so much. None of that's in the album. But in the work that we did together, it was like unearthing this huge treasure chest of visual images. She said, growing up, I always thought that Joanne's name brought about flowers. The idea that she was like soft powder pink and that flowers, because of the way that her parents talked about her. So that's actually really interesting to try and get to the bottom of that.
Mm. The psychology behind it.
Totally.
Okay.
I have a question here from Shane Settlemeyer. Which of your scenic designs changed the most from early concept to final result?
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that the answer I'm going to give you is the truth, but I can tell you that I worked on the design for Beetlejuice for about 5.5 years. And although we always knew that it was going to be a house of some sort, that one went through, you know, probably 40 permutations. You know, hyper realistic, totally abstract, one cohesive house unit, multiple pieces, you know, all that different stuff. And so, you know, that one changed a bunch. And by the way, we work, you know, as do performers, until someone says, put your pencils down, you know, the show is frozen. We work until the very last minute. And even from DC to New York, we changed it a lot. And even in previews and tech rehearsal, we changed it a lot.
Thank you. And Dominic Arlia asks, were you able to work closely with Lady Gaga in the process of creating your collaborations?
Very.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of the weird thing, the kind of like out of body experience part of it is there is no go between, right? There might be a go between of how they get to me. But you know, like when you're working with people, whether it's Mariah Carey or Lin-Manuel Miranda or anyone in between, you're just like sitting on their couch or they're sitting on your couch. And, you know, the more time you can spend with them, the more immersed you get into their mind frame and the more thinking that you do. And so the more you get to know them. So much so that my kids played a prank on my girlfriend the other day. You know, I have all their cell phone numbers, and my kids convinced my girlfriend that my youngest daughter, age 10, was texting with Gaga. And she believed it because we have her phone number. And so they went through this whole elaborate scheme, only to like then out it that the 14-year-old was texting, you know, was playing the joke. But yeah, you get to, you know, sit and figure it all out. I can remember the first real design meeting I had with Mariah Carey was so interesting because I didn't know kind of what her life was before I met her, and hearing how she felt kind of like a kept person, and she was married to Tony Miola for all those years, this big, powerful record executive. And she was with him from like the age of 18 or 19. And she had no idea how famous, how popular, how rich, how successful she was until she saw like a butterfly, you know, on their newel post at their house. And she got out, she divorced him, and then had no idea she had like 10 #1 records before she left it. Like, so it's interesting, like hearing that from her. I had a picture of who she was in my mind, but then hearing from her what it was like to find herself as a woman and as an artist and all of that is like totally fascinating, getting back to the psychology of trying to make spaces for these people.
Mm-hmm. Toba Talub asks, what was your favorite set that you've designed?
I don't have an answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that, you know, I've been asked that question a lot. I think people all want to hear me say Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of one. I can tell you that when we did Grease Live, that was a very important moment for me because I knew with the presentation of it that we were going to change the game of what live musicals were on television. That we were changing the form of that entertainment, and that felt really exciting. I can tell you that, you know, between Hamilton and Dear Evan Hansen back to back, what has been exciting is not necessarily design those shows, but kind of zeitgeist to be part of two shows that back to back won the Tony, and then have revitalized the way that the country and the world see theater artists and see shows. When our parents or my parents were kids, superstar entertainers were theater people, you know, Richard Burton, like all these like, you know, famous people who would go on talk shows, and like musical theater show songs were like top 10 on the radio. Then theater became wildly uncool, like when Nicole and I were doing theater, and Patrick Horrigan and Michael Horrigan, not cool. But Hamilton and Dear Evan Hansen has kind of made it cool again. And like, look at Lynn, it's like, he's like truly a bona fide star, like full stop. And it's weird because his stardom, and it's strange because he's a friend, it's like every single person, whether it's part of like the literati or pop culture or politicians or writers or regular people, want to be friends with him. And so theater is kind of back in the cool thing. That's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How many more times can I say cool in a sentence?
Ethan McKenna asks, how has the development of projection within theater changed your creative process and changed what is possible in set design?
I've never been, I used to not be a fan of projections as literal scenery. Like the idea of like, hey, I want to be in a library, let's project a picture of the library. I never thought that prescriptive imagery should be cinematic. I feel like if you want to go to the theater, you should go to the theater and you should see something more metaphorical, more abstract, more interesting than that. I think that no better tool than projections to act as kind of and descriptive in that way. So, you know, lights are hard to make look like clouds, as an example, right? Like lights are hard to show something that is more emotional and more multi-dimensional, but projections are incredible, an incredible tool in that way. And so I've started to think about it more like, if you can do any other way to not have it be a projection, you should. But when you need projections, there are almost no tools in the world more successful at what they're trying to do.
Thank you. And I think this will probably close us out, but I just wanted to ask, I know that we spoke about this at the beginning of the interview, but pertaining directly to theater, theaters have been hard hit by COVID, harder than even restaurants in terms of when we can come back. What do you think theater will look like in the near future?
You know, as I said, I'm the eternal optimist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you mean by near future. Yeah. So I think if you think the near future is any time before a vaccine, I think theater doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. You know, I am obviously fully entrenched in the live event, experiential theatrical world, and I'm having incredibly high level conversations with people, including, you know, Dr. Fauci's lead associate, you know, to get the science of it. I don't think there's any way that theater can successfully do what we do without socially, you know, and socially distant. It doesn't mm-hmm. work. It's not going to work. So if the near future is before the vaccine, I think we don't have a future.
Okay.
I think, and that is quote unquote traditional theater. there's some really interesting stuff. Like I saw there was an immersive experience that's happening in cars on upstate New York, where you're driving down a road and you're in your own car and you come upon a scene that's happening, and then you watch that scene play out and you go down another road to another scene, and things like that totally happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be really, really interesting. The truth is, we cannot have a musical without the musicians having no mask and they've got to be able to play their instruments.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to be in a pit together. We can socially distant backstage, but we can't really perform that way. Right. And so until there is testing, daily testing, we have no jobs.
And then this was a two-part question, so I asked the first one. How do you see the performing arts responding to society's call for social justice and equality? What do you think will change?
What do I think will change? Hopefully everything. Mm-hmm. I think that traditionally the world has looked to storytellers and members of the entertainment industry, even more so in some ways than politicians and teachers, to guide us along the journey of the righteousness or of righteousness. I fear that it is all smoke and mirrors and meaningless unless we go out and vote and change things legislatively, politically, and governmentally. I just think that the true problem that's going on is something that is systemic and is not a flash in the pan problem. And it's not like, that easily solved with rallies. I think rallies are good to show that there is community buy-in, and it's great to, show that there tends to be a huge amount of population that believes in this. But unless the people in power get changed, we're in trouble. I mean, here's another way to look at it. There are Black people who were shot and killed yesterday, and the entire world is watching. So let that sink in for a second, right? Everyone's watching, and it's still happening. So unless we can systematically change things, I think, I fear that we're not going to do something dramatic. Okay. I do think that the way to change things is to have people with a lot of influence, power, and money, and big amplifiers of their message speak out as often as they can. And those tend to be people in entertainment and athletics. So, here we go. Buckle up. It's an election year.
Mm-hmm. David, thank you so much. With the few minutes that are remaining, I'd like to send you back to your high school friend, Nicole, for any last thoughts that she has or any questions.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Lost you for a second. I said, hello, high school friend, David. Okay.
Hello.
So I want you, if you could, to reiterate the story you told in our pre-meeting conversation about how Miss Tromley did not cast you in the lead, and how, my girls and I probably should trademark this, but fail, we always say, is first attempt in learning. And
I think you're muted, Nicole. I think you're muted. There you go. Whoop.
Okay. Hi, where did you lose me?
Yeah.
I lost you at failed attempt at learning, but I think what you were asking me for was for that very, very famous story, at least in my family, about how I didn't get cast as Billy Bigelow in the aforementioned Carousel. I can tell you the story, and I'll tell it briefly. I was a senior. I was very involved in the band and the choir and the plays and in athletics, which was a kind of a rare place to be. And I thought that I had worked, and I think I was the president of the concert choir, so I was like pretty important. And I thought that I was lined up perfectly to be the lead in the show. I did not get the part, and I was crestfallen, and I got the part of like the second or third male lead, and Miss Trombley said to me, by the way, it was a good choice. I wasn't supposed to play that part. But Miss Trombley said to me, maybe you should, because, you have all this energy and you want to, be a more indispensable part of the community, you should go check out, the math teacher, Mr. Barnes, was like making, scenery. Go check that out. And it was there where I actually saw my first ever scenery being made, scenery being moved, scenery being designed. Miss Trombley would do on her script, on her, her score, she would make these little tiny thumbnail sketches that were like about this big, and they were in like black magic marker and colored in with marker, and they were little set sketches. And I remember kind of dismissing it a little, but to this day, I do set sketches just like that, thumbnail sketches. It was in that moment that and then, when I went to college, I knew I never wanted to audition again. That was so traumatic, but I wanted to work in the arts, and I eventually found my lane. But it was really in Mansfield High School and in that room where all of those seeds were planted for me. Everything from the act of creation, that special feeling that we get in performing, in the community that you get in putting something up. If you fail, try harder or find another way to like be a valuable member of the team, the collaboration, and so many things about being accountable, showing up, being on time, working hard. And I think I shared with you guys on the call, and I mean this with absolutely no BS. People do not try any less hard in a show at Mansfield High School or MMAS or anywhere else. The effort of creating, and in fact, the stakes are probably higher when you're earlier on in your career, because you don't have the accolades and, the career to support it if everything goes wrong. Like, I remember it was like life or death for me in that, in that audition. The only difference is the distribution method. A whole lot of people want to pay a lot of money to see Hamilton, and many more people will see it than a show at Mansfield High School. That said, no one's trying any less hard. It's a real, and that is like the lesson of like, go big or go home, that you need to understand that you are who you are. Your work ethic, your drive, your moral compass, your ability to focus. We all know that thing about being late is, like being early is on time and on time is late, and late is fired, that whole idea. But I live my life by that, not because I'm like obsessive and need to be there early, but because there's someone else waiting to meet you. And so all of those things, how you show up is how you show up, period. I learned all of that in Mansfield, and in a lot in and around the arts programs there. And I carry those things with me, every single day in every single collaboration. And the stakes are incredibly, incredibly high everywhere. So that's the story. Had I gotten gotten cast as Billy Bigelow, you'd probably be talking to a truck driver right now, or something else. I don't know, a barista, but I didn't, and now I'm a set designer.
Awesome. Thank you, David.
Sure. Thank you guys so much.
David, just one last question from the library. What would you say is your favorite book?
Oh my God, you mean as opposed to How to Design the World to Get What You Want? The current unwritten. I have a bunch. I reread Power Broker recently. Oh man, my favorite book. Well, I'll tell you what, just the other day, this is actually good tie-in. Just the other day, my girlfriend pulled off the shelf this old dusty copy of The Prophet, and Khalil Gibran, and I got it as a graduation gift from Barbara Trombley. And it was the first book of poetry and prose and things that I remember getting. And like, believe me, the 17-year-old me was like, I do not want this book. What does this book have to do with me and my life? But I have to say, I have carried that book with me. I open up to any page, you'll find something there of beauty and wonderment. And it's now on our bedside table, interestingly. So there's that.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, on behalf of the library. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
This is so wonderful. You had friends here from all over the country.
Oh, shucks. Thanks. Stay safe, guys.
You
All
too.
of you too. Good
Bye.
luck. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.